A spring convention about Scotland's future to unite people from across society with regular discussion and open debate, free from party politics, on matters of crucial importance to the nation, focusing clearly on Scotland's future and the achievement of meaningful self-determination. Land reform. Richard Walter John Montague Douglas Scott, 10th Duke of Buccleuch, 12th Duke of Queensberry, Chief of Clan Scott. One of his ancestors was James Douglas, 1662 to 1711, 2nd Duke of Queensberry, 1st Duke of Dover, who gained the most from the English treasury bribes dished out by Lord Stair to ensure the Acts of Union would be passed by the Scottish Parliament in 1707. £12,325, 10 shillings, and the Dukedom of Dover. This is one of his wee button bens, Drumlandrig Castle in Dumfries and Galloway. The Duke owns 217,000 acres, that's 880 square kilometres or 339.8 square miles of Scotland. Anders Poulsen, a Danish billionaire, owner of Bestseller, largest shareholder of Assos, and the largest shareholder of Zalando. This is one of his wee button bens, Aldury Castle, Loch Ness. 221,000 acres, that's 890 square kilometres or 345 square miles. It's owned by him. There are fewer than 444 private landowners. They own 50% of the private land of rural Scotland. Scotland's population is about 5.5 million, so most of the countryside is owned by less than 0.009% of the population. There is no more concentrated pattern of large-scale private land ownership found in any other place on earth. Feudal tenure was introduced by King David I. His reign was from 23rd of April 1124 to 24th of May 1153. Scotland was the last country to abolish it. Andy Whiteman's book, The Poor Had No Lawyers, is a must-read.
In 2014, and part of the remit of the Land Reform Review Group included mention that the structure of land ownership is a defining factor in the relationship between the land and the people. It can facilitate and promote development, but it can also hinder it. And that's really what this session is all about. That's what the land movement is all about, to release that resource for the benefit of the people who live in the country. And in 2014, the Land Reform Review Group published its final report. It contains 62 recommendations. So the question is, what happened to them? And thankfully, someone like Andy Whiteman has done an analysis of that on his cleverly named website, Land Matters. And of the 62 recommendations, 6 recommendations called for actions that were already underway. 19 have been implemented since the report, but 37 have not been implemented the recommendations from the Land Reform Review Group. So, a biggie in that for me is the Minister Paul Wheelhouse committed to complete the land register within 10 years, i.e. by 2024, so that the publicly owned land and all land in Scotland would be registered, and that just hasn't happened. And there are several other important issues. The Land Reform Review Group also established a short-term working group, and part of the duty there was to take forward the government's target of 1 million acres in community ownership within 10 years. So I was at Solmorostig that day when Alex Salmon gave the speech that announced the million acres target, and it wasn't in his speech. So that was another one of these things that came into his mind on the roof. 500,000 acres in community ownership in 2014, and we're now at 525,000, so it's not been a big change. So with that poor response to the Land Reform Review Group, the question that I'm left with, and possibly you too, is what appetite does the Scottish Government have for land reform? So I'm hoping that we might learn a bit of that today.
But 22 years of legislative land reform in Scotland. It was one of the first areas of work that was promised after devolution. Of course, modern land reform in Scotland is actually founded in the Property Acts in the 1880s. But what I plan to do today is really talk a little bit about how land is the foundation of really all cultural, economic, environmental and social activity in Scotland. It's absolutely central to the future of our nation. And who owns it and who controls its management and development has considerable power. The shaping of land management as well as the cultural and built environment is important to all of us, whether we live in rural Scotland as I do or urban Scotland. And land itself is also founded in language and identity and is a story of loss and a story of survival. So I'm the chair of Community Land Scotland, so thank you for the introduction. We're an organisation that represents community landowners across all of Scotland. Originally, they were obviously very focused in rural areas, but now responsibility is to promote the sustainable benefits of community development and community land ownership. We do a lot of work with other organisations to ensure that community landowners can access the support they need. And we do a lot of work promoting the idea of land reform and sustainable community development to demonstrate what can be done when you devolve democracy to a very local level. But it talks about ownership of land and property giving you the power to vote. Now, ownership of land and property is no longer the basis of being able to vote, but as we all know, it does confer considerable power in terms of opportunities, both to build housing and develop industries such as renewables or timber, to grow food, to shape the rural and built environment, and to leverage finance. And if you've got access to land, you can do all of those things. So although many of us are now divorced from the land, who owns it has a very real impact upon how our society and economy works. We need to sort of scrabble around a bit and dig into it to find out just how much power those that have land ownership control about financial networks that are dependent upon land ownership. People's connection to place is often expressed through land, but also a sense of ownership of local built environments on that. And that's central to our identity, to our political consciousness and empowerment. I don't know how many of you have been to Egg. That's been in community ownership now for coming up 30 years. The people that live on Egg own Egg. They own what happens on it, and they own the future of it, and they own the future of their children that live on Egg. And that's incredibly powerful. It's a really powerful thought for people who are bringing up their children in that community, that they will have a say over what happens in the future of that community. And other deeply important issues like affordable housing, around issues of depopulation, which are massive in many of our rural north and west communities. So many of you will know about Scotland's concentrated land ownership. We have 433 landowners who own over 50% of private rural land. Less than a quarter, 1%, owns 67% of private rural land. And despite us having 22 years of land reform legislation since the devolution, that figure, if anything, has only got worse. So something's not working. Only 3% of Scotland is community owned. And the reason for that is because there is a startling lack of regulation, transparency and oversight over both land sales and ownership, especially compared to most democratic modern societies. And this has serious impacts both on power and control, as I've already mentioned, but particularly on wealth accumulation, wealth distribution and wealth extraction. It's also resulted in depopulation, so many of the communities that you'll know from the north and west coast, the depopulation and demographic change figures are really startling. It's resulted in a housing crisis because we've seen many houses, particularly in rural areas, being lost, affordable housing and going into short-term lessons. It's resulted in one of the poorest levels of biodiversity in the world, and it's resulted in local monopolies over power and opportunity. So, I want to talk here about Grace. Now, Grace founded the View Park Conservation Group. Many of you will know about Egg and Gear and Noidart, the really big landowner buyouts. But Grace lives just outside Glasgow, and she was involved in setting up this conservation group that was interested in buying a piece of the last green space in their community. The heavy lifting that's done by civil society, and Grace and Maggie from Egg and Agnes von Golson, all those people are the heavy lifters in civil society. So they're the ones, like you, that turn out on a Tuesday night, every week of the year, to talk about how they want things to change locally and what they're going to do about it. So this is democracy at the most evolved level, and it's dependent on strong, determined, bloody-minded individuals or local business or local landowners control what they're doing with their local area. So Grace set up with colleagues and neighbours the View Park Conservation Group, and the whole purpose of that was about improving the quality of life for the people of View Park and the neighbouring areas through an enhanced natural environment. So they've done a phenomenal amount of work to save this piece of land, and it was all about, as Grace would say, getting more families out and about doing things together. Here's Langham down in the borders. So Langham Initiative was founded in 1994 as a partnership between the private and public sectors, a response to the post-industrial crisis.
Well, I mean, over the past 2 or 3 decades, Langham's seen a very steady decline. We've lost all of our main mills, and last year we lost Edinburgh Woolen Mill, which was
they went down south, didn't they, to the Carlisle?
Yes. So, we have so much to offer. It's a very, very proud community with an incredible sense of community spirit, and we've so much to offer visitors and people moving into the town that we felt that we needed to come together as an umbrella organisation to fight for the town, to fight for Langham's future.
Well, I'm delighted with the Langham Alliance initiative. It's about bringing together everybody in the community in Langham to build a future, a view of the future, and work towards that. Langham, like many small towns, has seen big changes with the mills in particular here no longer employing the number of people they did. So Langham has to have a different kind of future, but it's an incredibly attractive part of Scotland. There's a really, really strong community here, and we're well connected to Carlisle, to the motorway. So we've got a lot going for us, and that's what we have to build on. And what we have to get, which the Alliance have worked so hard to do, is community buy-in and everybody singing from the same hymn sheet in terms of what they want for the future of Langham.
So when the Blue Estate put Langham Moor on the market, this is a grouse moor, and they were looking for another owner who would take it on as a grouse moor and continue it in that use. But the community felt that that was not appropriate. They felt that actually there was a lot more they could do with this piece of land, which is a really significant estate in this area. And this was on the market by the Blue at over £6 million. At first that seemed like an impossible dream. They managed to raise £3.8 million in 6 months, which enabled the initial purchase of 5,200 acres to go ahead. And then in a second spurt, about 12 months later, they raised the rest of the money, and now they own over 10,000 acres of land, which was the former Langham Moor, which they've renamed the Tarras Valley Nature Reserve. There is positive move in land reform and community ownership, but there's still a huge amount to do. The government agreed to introduce another land reform bill. So we are working hard with partners to push for a strengthening of this legislation to ensure it provides a robust means of changing land ownership and management, to help address the climate and nature crises, but also to build a more equitable and just society. So just talking through in brief some of the changes that are being proposed with the bill. It talks about a transfer test. So when estates of a certain size come onto the market, there is a proposal that the Land and Communities Commissioner, which will be part of the Scottish Land Commission, gets to look at that estate and say, actually, is this the right use? Should we be looking at breaking this estate up to provide land for housing or land for other purposes? It's not focused on what we would call a public interest test. So that's thinking about how is this land owned and how is it managed in the public interest. It's got a threshold at the moment of 3,000 hectares, and Community Land Scotland are currently promoting a threshold of 500 hectare estates at which this will be applied to. It also excludes all urban and peri-urban communities, so it's only if you live on an estate which is over 3,000 hectares that any of this legislation will be relevant. It talks about introducing land management plans, so that are plans by which large landowners need to say what they're going to do with their land, be much more transparent about who owns it, and where the benefits from that land ownership is going. There are no penalties if you don't do that. There's no penalties for non-compliance. Prior notification of sale, so really that's enabling communities to be advised of sales if estates come on the market. So we've suggested some changes around public interest tests, around reducing and aligning thresholds, around an idea of introducing sites of community significance. So this would allow any community anywhere to identify a piece of land or an asset locally of importance to them, and that would then fall within the scope of the bill, so the community would then have the rights to identify that piece of land and ensure that if it does come to the market, then they get first right of refusal. Also talks about effective lotting processes, and we would like to go further and talk about people who can acquire and own land in Scotland, and should they meet certain criteria. And then we're also promoting prior notifications of sales being made more workable. So it's quite sort of complex and bureaucratic, but actually each of these would have quite a significant impact on communities being able to make better use of land locally. So the Land Reform Bill, why is this important? Again, it can seem quite bureaucratic and complex, but we know that land ownership and not land management is what matters, because land ownership confers power and it confers control, and it makes sure if you own the land that all of the benefits from the ownership of that land stay with you and are not distributed more fairly. There's an argument that large-scale land ownership, most of the European countries don't have large-scale land ownership in the way that we do, but they're actually managing nature restoration and recovery far more quickly than we are. There's also an argument about ECHR, and landowners are jumping up and down saying this is impacting on their private rights to own property. Well, it doesn't. About family farms, about how they'll be hugely impacted. But even at the lower limit of 500 hectares that Community Land Scotland are promoting, 96.4% of family farms, so they're not the big industrial farms on the East Coast, but family farms won't be affected. And finally, the other argument we hear is about deterring investment. And again, we've seen that investment can happen at all sorts of levels, particularly into projects that are owned by communities. And we've been running a campaign, Scotland's for sale, but who's buying? So a lot of you will have seen in the press about green lairs. So we've got a lot of interest from international financiers who see Scotland's land as a fantastic investment opportunity, particularly because there's so much public subsidy that the Scottish Government put into land ownership and land management, particularly around things like woodland creation, peatland restoration. We're going to have the equivalent of biodiversity credit, so it's a fantastic opportunity if you're living in America and you want a way to offset your carbon emissions from your private jet is to come and buy land in Scotland and plant some trees on it. And we see that happening. That's not scaremongering. We've got the biggest landowner in Scotland that's doing that at the moment, using his land up in the north to offset his private jet emissions. So I think the question for us all today is that what we think Scotland's land should be used for? It's quite a binary question now. It's like, should it be used to enable rich absentee landowners to offset their carbon emissions, or should we be looking at using Scotland's land, both rural and urban, for more affordable housing, to give our youngsters a chance on the ladder to get their own house, to create local jobs, to support our tourism industry, to support our other traditional industries?